we're going to bring up Adam Stalker. Adam is a researcher with the Innovative Mobility Group of UC Berkeley's Transportation Sustainable Research Center. Thank you, Adam.
Okay, working. All right, well, hello everyone. My name's Adam Stalker. I'm a research associate at the Transportation Sustainability Research Center. We're just a little bit about us to start off. We're one of 11 centers that is housed under the Institute of Transportation Studies that's a part of UC Berkeley. We're PI'd by Professor Susan Shaheen, my boss. And what we really do at TSRC is we study the impacts. And what I mean by impacts is travel behavior impacts and the environmental impacts and VMT impacts, vehicle miles traveled, change due to some of these new innovative mobility services that Sharon so nicely laid out. Things like car sharing, ride sharing, ride sourcing, TNCs, bike sharing, things like that. So I'm going to just really briefly define shared mobility, although Sharon did a great job, so I'll skip over that, and just kind of dive straight into some of our research and just give a very high-level snapshot of a couple of our findings. So today I'm going to talk about car sharing, bike sharing, ride sourcing, or TNCs, and transportation network companies. And ride sourcing is a name that we coined at UC Berkeley to define services like Uber and Lyft. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about shared automated vehicles. So this is the shared mobility ecosystem. Again, the definition of shared mobility is the use of shared transportation assets among multiple members. And you see on the left, there are core and incumbent services, so things like public transit, paratransit, traditional shuttles, and traditional car rental. And then on the right, we have some of these new emerging services, things like car sharing, microtransit, which is the name that we give to some of these new tech-enabled shuttles like Chariot, if you've ever seen that in San Francisco, that Ford actually just bought, and other things like that. So I'm going to start off talking a little bit about car sharing. So there's different flavors of car sharing. There's round-trip car sharing, so this would be your zip car or your city car share. This is where you rent a vehicle on a short-term basis, and you go pick it up at one place, you do your trip with it, and ultimately you have to take it back to the same location, hence the name round trip. It's typically pay by the hour or by the mile. Then there's also peer-to-peer car sharing. So this is typically also round trip in function, but this is where instead of the fleet of vehicles being owned by a business, so say Zipcar, they're actually individually owned vehicles. So they're vehicles that are shared peer-to-peer and a network operates it. So examples of this are Getaround or Turo or some North American operators. And then there's also one-way car sharing. So this is typically free-floating, pay by the minute, and you can take it point to point. It's fleet operated, so Car2Go is a good example of this. It's not in the Bay Area at present, but is in many places around North America. You basically take it from one place to another, leave it, end your trip, and there you go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the findings of a recent study we did last year on one-way free-floating car sharing. So we studied, we surveyed 10,000 North American members across 5 cities in North America, Calgary, San Diego, Seattle, Vancouver, and Washington, D.C. And we also had access to trip-level activity data, so actual trip-making data. And some of the metrics that we assessed were things like mode shift, travel behavior shift, but also vehicle miles traveled change, and ultimately greenhouse gas emissions change. Because I know, as the public sector, and many of you in this room, I know are in the public sector, these are, questions that are very important to assess on a societal level scale, on a city level scale, when you're making decisions about implementing these types of services. So this is a table just outlining some of our findings from the study. And mainly, I'm going to go over some of the highlights in the next slide, but mainly this is just to show that impacts depend on city, depend on location. This doesn't just go for car sharing, this goes for any shared mobility service, any transportation service really, so it's an important thing to keep in mind. But so we assessed metrics like vehicles sold, vehicles suppressed per car sharing vehicle on the road. So suppression means if Car2Go did not exist, the user would have gotten a vehicle. and therefore total vehicles removed per car sharing vehicle. And then we have percent reduction in VMT, vehicle miles traveled, because of the service in each of the cities, and percent reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, considering all the fuel economies of that change in VMT. So just to go over some of the key findings, between 2 to 5% of members sold a vehicle due to car sharing across the 5 cities, depending on the city, and 7 to 10% did not acquire a vehicle, so would have acquired a vehicle had Car2Go not existed. We typically see that the vehicles sold are a little bit older. So the average age across 5 cities was about 14.4 years of the vehicles that were being sold due to Car2Go. And that the VMT reduction ranges from 6% reduction to 16% reduction per household, with an average across 5 cities of 11%. And GHG reduction ranges from 4% to 18% with an average of 10%. And typically, kind of just a high-level overview of how we do that VMT, or vehicle miles traveled calculation, is we notice that there's a small percentage of members, so the 2 to 5 that sold and the 7 to 10 that suppressed a vehicle, that are either getting rid of or not buying a personal vehicle due to the existence of car sharing, in this case Car2Go. And even though that's a small chunk of the population, their decrease in driving is very large because they now don't have that fixed asset of a personal vehicle. And we notice that people's travel patterns change when they get rid of a vehicle and they start using shared modes, they start using transit. And so even though that's a small chunk of the population, they're driving a lot less, and when we aggregate them with the larger chunk of the population that's driving a marginal amount more due to Car2Go, we still see these net reductions in vehicle miles traveled and in greenhouse gas emissions. And we've seen this across multiple studies that have been done in the past as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about bike sharing and public bike sharing. So obviously we have some of the operators here today, which is great to see. This is a picture of Babs Bay Area Bike Share. This system is typically, it's point to point, it's paid by the half hour. There's monthly, yearly memberships, daily memberships, and docking stations, although there are different models emerging now, like Sobeys model. And so we also did a different 5-city study on bike sharing impacts. And this is in Washington, D.C., Capital Bike Share. And this map, I'll just take a second to explain what you're looking at here. We asked respondents in a survey if they increased their rail usage due to their bike sharing membership, which is in the green there. If they did not change their rail usage, and that's yellow, or if they decreased their rail usage, and that's in the red there. And each of these little pie charts represents a zip code. And so what's interesting about Washington, D.C. specifically is that you see kind of a lot of red, especially in the downtown area. So these are actually respondents that are saying that they decreased their rail usage due to their bike sharing membership. But what's interesting is as you get out into the suburbs a little bit of Washington, D.C., you start to see a bit more even split, a bit more green out there, meaning that members were increasing their rail usage a little bit. And so what's interesting is that, and we've noticed this across some other cities too in this study, is that in downtown, dense downtown areas with established rail transit systems, we actually see some mode replacement of rail transit due to bike sharing. And this could be due to kind of these short haul during peak hours, peak crowded transit hour trips, where people are actually replacing rail with a bike sharing trip that might be, only a couple miles long. But as you go into the suburbs, that, we could potentially see, a little bit more linking activity, that bike sharing is being served as that first last mile link to transit. And I'll show a different city here. This is Minneapolis, so the Nice Ride system in Minneapolis, which is a really good, very expansive system. And what's interesting is Minneapolis is a little less dense city than Washington, D.C., only a couple rail lines, but we asked them the same question, and this is the same map, and you see actually even in the downtown area that there's a higher proportion of people that are saying that they are increasing their rail usage due to bike sharing than decreasing in pretty much every zip code. And so in less dense cities, we may see the actually more of a linking effect due to bike sharing, but it's a nuanced story depending on the city. So I'm going to talk about ride sourcing or transportation network companies. This is the name we give to Uber and Lyft. Just very briefly, I want to note that we have a study coming up with NRDC, the National Resources Defense Council, looking at the impacts of Uber and Lyft. Again, things very similar to what I've shown today: modal shift, travel behavior impacts, linked to transit impacts, VMT and GHG impacts. That will be coming out probably in spring or summer of this year. We're working on it right now, and so keep an eye out for that. But I'll just give some of the very basic findings from an early exploratory study that was done in spring 2014 of 380 ride sourcing users in San Francisco. So Uber, Lyft, and the now defunct Sidecar. Of some of our colleagues in UC Berkeley did this in spring 2014. And we found that if ride sourcing were unavailable, 39% of people would have, or respondents would have taken a taxi, and 24% would have taken a bus. 4% entered public transit station as their destination, suggesting that some linking activity is happening. And 40% state that they reduced their driving due to ride sourcing services. But again, that study was 3 years ago, so the new one will be a lot more in-depth and more up-to-date. And I want to just touch very briefly on shared automated vehicles. We're beginning to do some research in that. I won't go too far into it because the panel, I think, did a great job today. But we're starting to do a little bit of research at our center about specifically the business models around the sharing of automated vehicles. So, there's a lot of talk about, and I was very glad to see the panel today talk a lot and right from the start, and Lauren, about the shared, model and the fleet-based model. But what's interesting is, I think the panel mentioned today too, that even today the advent of automation to a regular vehicle could be somewhere in the realm of $5,000 to $10,000 more. Even, will certainly come down over the years. I think that there will be a decent amount of individual ownership as well, especially in more suburban environments like we have here. And what's interesting is that you could even imagine a peer-to-peer model, peer-to-peer shared model, where when you're not using your individual automated vehicle, it's going and making money for you as an asset on the side that's part of maybe a mixed fleet. And I think that there's a lot of interesting business models that we haven't even thought of yet that could emerge. So we're starting to do some work on that at our center. And that's my talk. I'm going to do a shameless pitch to end about our weekly newsletter. It's called Last Week in Innovative Mobility. It looks like this, and if you go to imart.berkeley.edu and put your info in, you can get it in your inbox every week. So thanks for having me, and looking forward to the rest of the discussions.